All right, so there are several different ways that distributive property can be presented, and we've got to be able to distinguish that, yes, that's what's actually happening, that we are going to distribute in each of the expressions or eventually equations. And the first thing we have to understand is that distributive property uses the operation of multiplication. And we have to know what distribute means. Distribute, if I distribute money or if I distribute paper out to the class, I'm handing something out to everybody. And having a number outside of the parentheses, this -2 that's here, that means that we are going to distribute it to the terms inside the parentheses. Now, one of the issues that I always have is the word minus. Inside the parentheses, this is 3x minus 8. I'm going to erase that minus sign, or we could rewrite it. And I always want to rewrite it so that I'm adding a negative. That helps us understand the type of terms that we have. We have two terms inside of the parentheses. We have a 3x and we have a -8 now, because we changed that subtraction problem to adding a negative. And what we're going to do is we are going to address and kind of show that, oh yeah, 3x is positive and the 8 is negative. We're going to multiply each of those terms by a -2. Now, what happens when we multiply by a negative number? Well, it's going to change the type of term that we have to the opposite. So down below, I'm going to write down two multiplication problems, both of which will have -2 in them. I'm going to multiply -2 times my first term, 3x, and then I'm going to write -2 times -8. Up above each of these terms, everybody, let's write down what type of term we have for each. The 2 is a negative, the 3x is a positive. Over in the other multiplication problem, we have a negative and a negative. And if anybody remembers what we went through before, you got to remember, other than a positive times a positive equaling a positive, that's kind of the outlier, we always got to have two negatives. If you think about it, with multiplication and division, if I had a negative times a positive, the answer has to be negative because I have to have two negatives. If I had a positive times a negative, the answer has to be negative because I have to have two negatives. And the last one, if we had two negatives, a negative times a negative, it's going to equal a positive because we already had those two negatives that are multiplying together. So when I look back at what I'm going to multiply, I'm going to multiply a negative times a positive, which is going to give me a negative answer. What is 2 times 3x going to give us? Well, if I have 3 x's and I want to double it, it's going to be 6 x's. So we're going to end up with 6 negative x's. On the other side, we're multiplying two integers together. Negative times a negative gives us a positive, and 2 times 8 is 16. And so this is going to end up being our simplified expression because x's cannot go with numbers. We know that. What do I have to put in between them to show that we're connecting them or that we want them to go together if possible? We want to make sure that we have an addition sign. Well done. And if you would, please write that this is our simplified answer. Again, the reason we want to make sure that we understand it's a simplified answer is we don't know what x is, and we know that x's and numbers, they can't go together. So let's take a look at another one that is going to be a little bit different way. It's going to look a little bit different on how we should distribute. And again, if we say the word minus, we want to change it. The way that I read this is 3 minus 4 times -x plus 1. I said minus right here, so I'm going to rewrite this. I'm going to actually use my eraser, and I'm going to change it so that I am adding a negative. And this makes it a little bit more clear for me that I'm going to distribute a -4 to each term inside the parentheses. I've got a negative x and I have a positive 1. Negative x, positive 1. We have to multiply before we put numbers together. The most common mistake that students make is they'll put this 3 and the -4 together first and get -1. Do not do that. Remember order of operations. We have to multiply before we add or subtract. Okay, let's multiply, and we have -4 times the first term, which is negative x. Negative times a negative. The second one, we're going to also have -4 times positive 1. Negative times a positive. And then we got this 3 that's kind of hanging around that we're going to bring down, and we're going to add it to something. If we have a number left over as one of our terms, we can put it with that. What's a negative times a negative? Positive. Good. And that's going to give us, good, I heard it, 4x. A negative times a positive, we have to have 2 negatives in here. It's going to be a negative. 4 times 1 is 4. I'm going to bring my 3 down, and here's the 3 terms that I have. So we're simplifying this. I see 2 things that can go together. Bless you. I see that numbers that don't have any variable with them can be combined and simplified further. What's -4? What do we have more of, negatives or positives? How many more negatives do we have? 1. So our final answer is 4x plus a -1. Or if we wanted to use the commutative property, a different way that we can write this, Mr. Parks' favorite word is or, we could write it as -1 plus 4x. Either way, that's right, they are both the same. They are both simplified answers. But again, you found that distributive property, it's kind of hiding there, and it made it a little bit more difficult because they put a 3 in front of it saying, hey, add this together first. They're trying to lure you into a mistake. Okay? Let's find another camera here. Here is a third way that they can show distributive property and hide it on you. Hide it on you. Inside the parentheses, we have 2 terms. We have a positive 8. We have a positive 3y. What is outside of the parentheses is a negative sign. We've seen it a bit with subtracting expressions. But when it's all out there by itself, it means that we want to distribute that negative sign to each of the terms inside. In fact, it means that you're actually multiplying by the number -1. If we know that we're multiplying by a negative or a -1, let's do it. I'm going to show that I'm multiplying by -1 to the first term of 8. I'm going to show that I'm multiplying by -1 to the second term, 3y. And again, just putting an N or a P for negative and positive tends to help us visualize what type of answer we should get at the end. I only see 1 negative, so that means my answer has to be negative. 8 times 1 is going to give me 8. Negative times a positive has to be a negative. 3y times 1 is going to be 3y's. And all I need to do to get my simplified answer is to put that plus sign in between the 2 terms. We can write our favorite word, or. And because of the commutative property, we can write down 3y first plus -8. Commutative property works with addition and also multiplication. And when we switch so that we don't have subtraction and we're adding negatives, it allows us to do that. Last one. The last one has a term on the back side of the parentheses. And it has that minus sign out front once again. As we just learned, we are multiplying by -1 here. So let's put that 1 and slide it in there. And what I wanted to make sure that you guys knew here was that you only distribute to the terms that are inside the parentheses, not a term that's outside the parentheses. So 8 is not going to get multiplied by -1. Inside the parentheses, we've got a positive x, we've got a positive 12. Mark those. Outside the parentheses, we have a -1 that we're going to distribute. Again, I'm only distributing to the terms that are inside the parentheses. Let's write the multiplication down. -1 is going to be multiplied by x, and it's also going to multiply itself times 12. And then we have an 8 left over that we're going to add on, hopefully, to some sort of number term. I've got a negative times a positive here. I've got a negative times a positive here. Both answers to these multiplication problems have to be negative. Negative times positive is going to give me negative x or -1x. Negative times a positive for the other multiplication problem is going to give me -12. And then I have an 8. Well, if I look at these three terms, I know right away -12 and 8 can go together and simplify further, can't they? Do we have more negative number or positive number? So how many more negatives are there than positives?
4.
So we have 4 negatives. I have a -x. And if I want to show these two terms in an expression, I've got to combine them with that plus sign. Commutative property tells us we could also write this as -4 plus -x. Both ways are correct. And we've got to be aware that both ways, they could show us. But those are 4 ways that distributive property can be shown to you. And now I think you're going to be a little bit better off at recognizing when distributive property shows up.